should be going live now. Okay, we're good to go. Just sharing the link in our community chat, and then we can kick off. So welcome to today's live video AMA. It's the 11th community AMA in this series. It's also the new year, 2023. Exciting stuff ahead. So let's dive straight into the pre-submitted questions. First of all, I'd like to thank all of the community members who took the time to send in questions. We were really surprised by the high quality of the questions this time. And I'd like to propose that we zoom in on one topic in particular, which is the decentralization of clinical research. But before we do that, I'd like to welcome my co-hosts, Adil Esbai, CEO at Triall, Niels Klomp, our CTO, and Dr. Arno Bisschop, our Chief Medical Officer.
Thanks for setting this up, Ray, as always. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
So let's start with the first question. How can decentralization in clinical trials be leveraged to address challenges and disparities in patient recruitment and participation, particularly in underrepresented and marginalized populations? Adil, would you like to take that question?
Well, I think this is an excellent question, and it's really touching upon the core of why we initially established Triall, and that is really to bridge the so-called inequality gap. We know and we see that there's a lot of great research being done, but we also see that the diversification of patients in clinical trials is a big issue. For instance, there is still a lot to be done in investigating why women and men, for instance, behave differently in using specific medications. But that research is not always done for various reasons. One of the reasons is maybe because the right tools are not there to conduct these kind of clinical trials. We are all about democratization of healthcare, more specifically of democratization of clinical research activities. So we feel that through some of our blockchain-enabled technologies, we can really find the right patient that has a specific unmet medical need and match them with a research question or a clinical trial that could potentially solve that. So we feel that we could be one of the missing links in making sure that more people across the board, different ages, different ethnic, whereabouts, a different geography, right, from all different kinds of walks in life, that they're also being, exposed to these clinical trials, so that within their own characteristics, we can learn more about what works for them and what doesn't work. Because we already know that one solution, one research methodology needs to be investigated in many different ways to look at how different people react on it. And at Triall, because we have this overarching ecosystem and this elaborate software solution where we can basically manage all aspects of a clinical trial, we at least think that our solution can help bridge that gap and generate reliable data.
Thanks, Adil. So just to very briefly summarize, you would say that because of the end-to-end software platform that we offer and the versatility of that platform, we are able to access patient pools, perhaps outside of the clinic, but yeah, in other areas where they are now currently not being engaged and involved.
Yeah, and thanks, Ray. Absolutely. So in the past decade, I think we've seen that the research is moving towards personalized medicine, which is great, because we then really solve the problem of that individual. But there should also be a tailor-made approach to connecting that specific patient. And that is something that we feel that we can add a lot of value to really have this personalized approach of how this patient is experiencing the clinical trial. And I think our ecosystem is not only complete in terms of offering, but it's also really making the experience of the journey of a patient during the clinical trial much easier and hopefully a more enjoyable event. And we already know that research indicates that if the patient journey is pleasant, that the quality and the integrity of data is also winning in those cases.
Thanks, Adil. I think that provides a great bridge to the next question. How does the concept of decentralization in clinical trials align with the overall shift towards more patient-centric and data-driven approaches in healthcare? Arno, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, of course, Ray, thanks. I think this question is in line with the question before answered by Hadil. And I think you can look at decentralization from many angles. And as a doctor, I'm thinking about when I look at patient centricity, for me, that really means that you put the patient in the center, so that all care around this patient is being organized towards him or her. And I think that we have the technology now to do so. So if you take, for example, and we must reckon that most patients are elderly patients, right? So most people become only ill because of due to age or aging. So what we see is that it will be very nice and very helpful for people if they are just being helped outside of the hospital, and that really helps. That is for me really the angle of decentralization here. And I also think that if you look at data management of a specific patient, that what you see now is that when a patient goes from a care setting to hospital to another institution, you see that data is scattered actually all across these institutions. And I think that the only way of doing this right, so centralizing the data, that the only way to do so is by taking care of that the data is actually at the patient in a way, so that the patient carries his or her data at all time with him or her. And I think that is really important, and that is really in line, I think, with being patient-centric. So from the angle, as a doctor, I think that patient centricity is all about bringing the technology towards the patient and making sure that the data is captured at the patient side and owned by the patient. So I'm aware that it's a bit of a doctor answer, a bit weary, but I'm just trying to make a connection with the answer that Hadil just gave, and I see that there's a slight different angle with decentralization. So I think that to sum up, I think the decentralization for me is really bringing care to a patient instead of bringing the patients to care.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arno. And I think it's very relevant to look at decentralization from different angles. I think we've also done that in previous AMAs and in some of the articles that we've published, because when it comes to decentralization, it's a very multifaceted topic, and it means different things depending on the context. So it's always good to, well, first of all, outline what we are talking about and also from what perspective. Yeah, very happy that you also bring in your perspective as a clinician. And of course, with the clinician being one of the primary contact points for patients within a clinical trial and outside of a clinical trial, that's a great addition to some of these viewpoints. Well, maybe
and I think that if I may add, Ray, I think that the time is now. I think that more and more clinicians see that this is the next big step in healthcare. And I see that the younger generation, or the younger thinking generation, is really working towards really providing patients with care at the place they live. And especially for elderly patients, that could be a very important thing, because imagine if you are 95 years old and you need to go to the hospital 3 times a week and you live in a remote area. That's virtually impossible. So this is really happening now, and I think it's really necessary now, also because we become older and older.
Absolutely. So now we've sort of covered very briefly how decentralization can benefit diversity and how it can benefit patient centricity and a more data-driven approach. I think it will be great to also have a look at some of the underlying technologies that we're using. And we got a question specifically on that. So Niels, if that's okay with you, I'm gonna hand the next question to you, which is how can the use of blockchain and self-sovereign identity technologies support the decentralization of clinical trials? And what are the implications of this integration on data security and data privacy?
Okay, that's multiple questions in one, actually, but happy to answer. I think also about what Arno described about being patient-centric. We also see, of course, that especially since the pandemic, the world has changed in terms of people working and doing more online, working remotely. That's also true for clinical trials. There's a more growing need to have to basically both be able to communicate with each other, both online and offline. Clinical trials are conducted and can be conducted in multiple locations, sometimes using disparate systems. And of course, with the technology like blockchain, like self-sovereign identity, which are decentralized and distributed protocols by its nature, this can be helped. And how can this help you? Simply because blockchain technology allows you, for instance, to connect multiple different systems to each other and have a single source of truth. And SSI technology is very important in there as well, because in order for you to have a system which you can both use online and offline and in a distributed fashion, you will also want to have identities. So you want to make sure that whenever you're talking to me in person, well, you could double check, of course, my passport or my ID card. But what happens if we're doing it online and we're doing it not on a video conference like we're doing now, and you haven't met me? How do you know that it's really me? Or the other way around, how do I know as a patient that a person's accessing certain data are really associated with this clinical trial? And that's where self-sovereign identity steps in. Self-sovereign identity helps both in terms of security, so making sure that the right people access the right data and have the permissions to access the right data. It also makes sure that the other party really can be sure that they are talking to the right person, so authentication basically. And SSI is really also about decentralized data ownership, so making sure that patients, as was also already, I guess, a little bit discussed in previous two questions, that the patients are really also in control about their own data, which is a vital and an important part in self-sovereign identity technology, you being in control. And I think one of the last things, which is not something, which is equally important, I would say, is the privacy aspect of these technologies. So we have on one hand, we have blockchain, on the other hand, we have SSI technology. The blockchain helps in providing, for instance, a common view of the data, in providing an audit trail, in providing accessibility. SSI provides in safety and self-control of data, provides in identity, so authentication and authorization. But it's important to also know that at the same time, those techniques are also privacy preserving. So no data of a person, so personally identifiable information, is stored on a blockchain, simply because, well, a blockchain by its nature, of course, is immutable. and you don't want to have any personally identifiable information on a medium which is immutable, so which cannot be changed, both from a law. In certain jurisdictions, the law wouldn't allow for it. So, for instance, in the European Union, but also just from a common sense perspective, if you want to have data removed or it needs to be changed, yeah, of course, on a blockchain that doesn't work. And that's also where self-sovereign identity technology comes in. Self-sovereign identity technology, first of all, puts you in control of the data. Second of all, it also ensures that you can only disclose the information you would like to disclose. Just to give you a really small example, instead of disclosing, for instance, my date of birth and my name and everything associated with me, my address, for instance, if the question would only be, okay, is this patient above a certain age threshold, let's say 21, well, I passed that a long time ago, but then instead of giving my exact date of birth, I could just have this predicate stating, okay, I'm over 21. And that over 21 is, of course, coming from my exact date of birth, but I can only disclose that signed fact by a party which has done a certain check that I am over 21, that I am over 21. And that means that the other party doesn't get additional data. And that's also one of the vital aspects of self-sovereign identity. So the privacy preserving techniques being associated with it.
Yeah, and it's a very powerful concept that fits perfectly within GDPR regulations and in this whole overarching idea of giving users more control over their personal data. I think on top of that, this whole idea of being able to actually connect with patients remotely in a way that is secure, privacy preserving and interoperable, that's essentially what it's all about. And it happens to be that blockchain and self-sovereign identity seem to be very suitable technologies for enabling that in an increasingly digital world. If you are watching this and you'd like to have a further deep dive into this topic, I can highly recommend reading an article that we posted this month on our blog at triall.io. It's called Decentralizing Clinical Research, the Real-World Implications of Blockchain and Self-Sovereign Identity. So if you're interested in this topic, I'd like to refer you to that article. For now, we're going to jump to the next question. And I'll be happy to answer this one. What are the pros and cons of a Web 3.0 clinical trial compared to an actual clinical trial? What special technologies does Triall have to maximize the advantages of medical research on your platform? Well, I'm just going to focus primarily on the first part of that question. And again, this is a little bit like talking about decentralization. Web 3.0 can mean different things to different people, but I think there's this overarching theme of providing users with more control and enabling a more peer-to-peer way of interaction. And I think if you would look at the concept of a Web 3.0 clinical trial, that's what it's all about for us. So enabling new ownership models where we can empower users by providing them with more control and ownership over their data. And in that way, also enable new sort of markets. Well, to make that very concrete, you can, for instance, think of someone with an Apple smartwatch who is gathering a lot of interesting health data. And using this infrastructure, that user would actually be able to offer that healthcare data for research purposes, or might even be able to monetize that data. So there are a couple of things that are truly unique here. Well, first of all, that person will be able to directly share that data with an interested party. So in that peer-to-peer fashion, that person would also have increased control over how that data is being used. And in that sense, you can also think about the possibility to actually retract access to data, or actually say, I would like to make this data available to certain non-profit organizations, but not to a certain pharma company, or vice versa. So this really allows for new ways of data sharing, where the patient or the data provider has much more control over how their data is being used for research purposes. And we think, apart from the fact that it actually enables these new markets, it will also serve as an additional stimuli for boosting patient recruitment, patient retention, and patient engagement. In terms of the negative side of that, you can, of course, imagine that this might also hamper innovation in some sense. So, for instance, if every patient would have to sign off for every type of data use, it might actually hamper the development of a new drug. So there's this sort of power balance between sponsor and the patient, where currently speaking, most of the power is still at the sponsor. So the patient only signs off for participating in a study once. And after that, they're sort of left in the dark about what happens with their data. But we think there should be a little bit of a power shift towards the patient, where the sponsor is not the only owner of the data, but where the patient also has some form of ownership. And depending on the specific use case, specific study, or a specific therapeutic area, that patient could either have a lot more power or just a little bit more say, etc., etc. That brings me to the next question. Again, this is a question about decentralization, and it is as follows: how does the team operationalize decentralized clinical trial study designs? To some extent, the success of clinical trials requires transformations in trial design, conduct, and assessment. Well, if I may answer that question, I think it's important to note that this whole trend of digitalization and digital transformation as a whole is not just doing things digitally. In other words, we cannot simply copy-paste paper-based processes to a digital setting and expect things to just work out fine. And that's a very important thing to note, because that means that sponsors and CROs that are currently considering digital transformation, or are currently in the midst of digital transformation, should really do a proper assessment of the impact of adapting different digital tools in their operations. And that could mean that, for instance, they need to alter their standard operating procedures. They might be required to alter their quality management system, all with the purpose of enabling an organization, enabling the people and the underlying processes to be better suited to these digital tools. And that's something where we can and want to help our customers, because we understand that this can be a complex undertaking, but when done right, it can really make a difference, and it can really benefit greatly to the success of a digital transformation project.
Yeah, Ray, if I may add a few notes
Sure.
there. Right. So I think decentralization is a trend that is unstoppable. But the human element is something that will always need to be there. We think that if you implement decentralization in a right way, that you have more time for the human element. At the end of the day, we're still dealing with people in a clinical trial. So the relationship, the touch points between an investigator and a patient at the beginning of the study, for instance, is still invaluable. But we also think, so that means that if organizations are looking into moving, from classical research lines and the way they manage their clinical trials to a decentralization, it is a very custom-tailored discussion. Exactly what you say, on the innovator side. But it's also a very, very tailor-made discussion on the patient side and on the investigator side, because for some diseases that we study, it is very difficult to implement decentralization. For instance, if you're participating in an early stage complex clinical trial where we really don't know a lot, then you can imagine that the level of decentralization or virtualization is very different than if you study something that has gone through many years of research and the disease maybe not that complex. So it's really a custom-tailored discussion. While on the other hand, again, we see that the trend towards digitalization, towards managing things remotely, towards capturing data from different places and all combining them as part of answering this one big main question that we have, i.e., does this work? Is it safe? It's just a very complex conversation. But I think that we as Triall, we can be a guide there as well. And so I think I would like to share with all the Triallians that we're not only looking into our own ecosystem, but we're talking to many stakeholders. These can be CROs, these can be pharma companies who are really thinking about how to decentralize their research activities. And yeah, so far, I think, we've been receiving some great feedback. We're still learning a lot. We see that the field is very fast evolving, and we also see that the groups that are early adopters into at least trying to investigate more about this will probably be the winners on the long end.
Absolutely. And this is a digital transformation that's happening at all levels, like you say. So this is happening at the sponsor, CRO level, the site level, the patient's level, and enable to be successful, we need buy-in from all these stakeholders, and we need to consider all of their viewpoints. So thank you for the great addition there, Hadil. Looking at the time, I think we will have time for one more question. And I'm just looking at some of the pre-sent questions. I think I'm going to go for another question for Arno. And this one really relates to some of the things that we've mentioned as part of our bigger mission. So getting new medicines to the patient in a shorter time frame. The question is, how do you intend to hasten the development of effective vaccinations and medications at reasonable prices?
Well, that is a great question. I think it's on the one hand, it's a very simple to answer question. On the other hand, it is even as hard. I mean, if you look at the simple answer, I think that what we always talk about, right, also in these AMAs, is that we with our trial kit and our trial platform and all the technology that we bring, we are able to make trials more efficient. So if you take getting to the market, right? So that's what needs to be the process of getting to the market for a vaccination involves a clinical trial. So the simple answer is, if you're able to make the clinical trial towards the market entry more efficient, then you hasten the process. So vaccinations will come to the market sooner. From an economic perspective, if something is more efficient, it's probably also cheaper. So if you take a clinical trial, which is at this point in time is very lengthy, cost inefficient, so very expensive, not always a guarantee for success, so even more costs need to be made. I assume that if you are able to hasten process clinical trial towards getting to market entry, then it will also be more cost effective. So what we see is that if you're able to make the whole process more efficient, that's what we're working on within our company, then I assume that in the end we will make the whole the whole access towards vaccination, but also to other medicine, cheaper. And obviously there's a lot that comes with that, but that's the hypothesis that we have within our team, is that if you make it more efficient, it's faster, so people get entry of, they're able to get medication or vaccination sooner and at a more affordable price.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, there are really factors there that are in our control, which is the whole clinical development track, making that more efficient and cost effective. And then, of course, you have the whole drug pricing aspect, which is not something we can directly control, I would argue, but it's certainly something that we aim to control indirectly by making the whole development track more cost efficient. So thanks for that great addition. That has brought us to the end of this AMA. Yeah, similar to our last editions, we will be back in the end of February, answering both pre-submitted and live questions from the community. Adil, Niels, Arno, I really like to thank you for joining me on this session again. And I hope to have you with me again next time.
Well, we see each other for another 11 times this year, right? So looking forward.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay.